Hello. Well, today I'm in the garden and was out with the dogs for a little while. I thought I'd start my talk nearer God's heart, as the old verse says. But come in now. What I found were two tapes, old cassette tapes. One was of Doris Stokes, and the other was Maurice Barbanel, the trance medium for Silver Birch, the spokesperson for the group that he worked with. And I think he would have not have approved of me splitting that sentence up like that, with whom he worked. Like me, I think, or like him, a stickler I am for language. Now, Doris, of course, was a very famous medium. She became very famous in the theatre, as well as around the churches, which is where of course she started. And Silver Birch, for whom Maurice Barbanel was the medium entranced, his words were written down, of course spoken, as you can see, at circle through Maurice, but and transcribed and later published, volumes of books, in fact. But he was first published, or they were first published, the group. There's Doris looking over my shoulder. And they belong to her too, those healing hands there. I think that the sculptor may have modelled it on John's hands, her husband. And not just the Dure portrait. But yes, the Psychic News was the weekly spiritualist newspaper founded by Maurice Barbanel and bankrolled by Arthur Findlay, of the Arthur Findlay College fame. And books, of course, he wrote many books on spiritualism. He was brought into spiritualism, in fact, through visiting a trance medium, John Sloan, and it was that they brought him into this way of life. And in fact, it was a medium called Ivy Scott who brought me into this way of life. Ivy Scott was a platform medium, and it's interesting, isn't it, that there are all these different forms of mediumship, all equally valid, all adding in to the hodgepodge of the stuffing, the pith and moment of spiritualism itself. Well, these are all mediums who have communicated with the realms of spirit, different levels, and have different effects on people. And Psychic News, to get back to that, was the vehicle that the group, the spokesperson Silver Birch, decided that would be a good thing to have. And of course, in those days, 1932, when it was launched, there wasn't anything like the social media that we have now. Newspapers and pamphlets and journals were the thing, printed, and radio was even really in its infancy, and television barely so, and there you are. And I think the talking pictures had just about come out by then. But the thing is that the messages are and have always been the most important factor in spiritualism. There were messages from spirit millennia ago, and that those teachings and revelations are very much in evidence in what we call the Bible and in other sacred texts, and certainly the Quran is attributed to the mediumship of Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it's interesting, isn't it, that these days the messages from what I call the astral plane, the lower levels, have become more and more and more popular, and a bit like the tabloid newspapers really, as opposed to the broadsheets like the Telegraph and so on, the Times as it used to be. But yeah, I just thought that you might like to know a little bit about where I'm coming from, which is from both directions really, because as I developed my own mediumship, as so many people find, I found that there were these different levels of consciousness, and ultimately there's the one that we call trance, which is what I've always said is sort of like being almost dead but not quite, still breathing just about, when you are literally on that borderline between this life and the next. And that's where all these elevated beings, their wonderful knowledge and wisdom come in. And one of the things that always troubled me was that there are disagreements, if you like, of philosophy between some of those elevated beings, and you know, it has given rise to some dispute down here. You know, the questions of reincarnation, and then when that's in modern times, but in the olden days, you know, there were a lot of visionary prophets who sort of walked about the earth, you know, professing doom and gloom and ultimate apocalypse or apocalypse. And yeah, so there are all those things to take into account. I was fortunate, Rev Brown, who's no longer with the same society as myself, makes no odds. We're all different, and we all belong to different organisations and groups, of course, within spiritualism, according to the philosophies we hold and the principles and so on. Although the basic ones are the same, and the absolute first one is, of course, that that there is an afterlife, and that those who are living in that afterlife can communicate back to this life through mediums, and all the other stuff comes after it. Spiritualism, as we know, was founded basically by a family of mediums, the Fox sisters, the Fox family. Now, here's my stuff back to front, of course. Now, the group that works with me had no name until they said to me that they thought it would be a good idea, when I was editor of Psychic News, if I published some of their thoughts. And I was to do this once a week, but it was a weekly newspaper. Goodness knows if it had been a daily, that would have been something else. We'd have had a volume, very, very big, large volumes by now. But anyway, so this is what I did, and Kathy actually asked me the questions, and the questions that she was asking me were questions that had been asked of the previous editor, Maurice Barbanel's group that he worked with, and Silver Birch, and it was so interesting because they gave answers that actually coincided with the original answers, and yet had a sort of a modern nuance attached to them. It was very, very interesting. So that's the thing. The questions that you'll find asked in the book that we made up, that Rev Nick made up, are actually questions that Kathy found in the questions being asked of Silver Birch all those years before. So I thought I'd read you something of that. I mentioned about the Bible, I think, about the Revelations. Yes, I'm sure I did. The trouble is with us spiritualist mediums, you know, is when we're giving a talk or an address or anything like that, them upstairs tend to sort of guide our thoughts, and so therefore we very often can't remember what we've said the last minute. So I would say to you that you know, in the Bible there are lots and lots of instances of spiritualist phenomena, and it's and some of the words that were said. For instance, you know, our guides always tell us, and our people always tell us, that this earth plane is really dark and gloomy. We think it's got light on it, but they say compared to the supernal light of the beyond, this is dark and foggy. And interesting, St. Paul wrote in his letter to the Ephesians, for you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light. And Isaiah, he says, who among you hears the Lord and obeys the word of his servant? Let the one who walks in the dark, who has no light, trust in the name of the Lord and not rely on their God. Which is interesting, this idea of you know, walking in the light of spirit. That's what we have to do. And the Great Spirit, aka God,